Ethan Caldwell, a 28-year-old UI designer recovering from burnout, rents a long-abandoned schoolhouse repurposed into a private home at the edge of Blackridge Hollow, Virginia. The place has a quiet charm, aged wood, dusty air, and tall windows overlooking a dense forest. But on his first night, soft tapping on the rear window wakes him. Written in fog condensation are 4 words. I see you now. Part 2. The window that remembers. The next evening, he hears it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, he shines a flashlight through the glass. A tall figure stands just outside. No face, no eyes. Only the outline of a man, still as a painting. Then it vanishes. When he checks the window, the message has changed. You were always here. Part 3. The Archivist's Hint. At a nearby historical society, Ethan meets Julia Reeves, a former teacher turned local archivist. She tells him the building was once the Blackridge Grammar School. Closed in 1983 after a mental breakdown led teacher Isaiah Crowley to lock students in the basement. He vanished without a trace, but rumors claim he gouged out his own eyes. The school was sealed, sold, forgotten, until now. Part 4. The Dream of the Bell. Ethan wakes to the sound of a school bell, but the building has no bell. He checks outside. Nothing. Yet in his dreams, he sees students seated silently while a faceless teacher writes on the walls with chalk made from teeth. The message echoes. You can't leave mid-lesson. Part 5. Flickers and static. His old TV turns itself onto static every night at the same time, 3:11 a.m. At first he unplugs it. It still turns on. The static starts to whisper syllables. Then names. His name. His parents' names. Then finally, attendance is mandatory. Part 6. Burned into glass. One morning, Ethan discovers a name carved in the inside of the window glass. Crowley. Not scratched, but embedded in the pane like fossilized ash. When he tries to record it, the name disappears from the camera footage, but his reflection blinks without him. Part 7. A missing photograph. Julia brings an old photo of the original faculty. Crowley stands at the edge, barely visible. She gasps, that photo's wrong. He was never in that one. She checks the original copy at the archives. Crowley's not in it. Only Ethan's version has him. And Crowley's hand is resting on someone's shoulder. Ethan's. Part 8. Faces in the wallpaper. Wallpaper starts peeling in Ethan's hallway. Beneath it, faint outlines of faces begin appearing. Children's faces etched directly into the drywall like charcoal silhouettes. Some cry. Others stare. One looks just like Julia as a girl. Part 9. Julia's scar. Julia reveals she was one of Crowley's students, the only one to escape. She was home, sick the day the doors locked. The memory was repressed until now. When Ethan shows her the message on the window, she goes pale. He's building a class again. Part 10. Desk without name. Ethan finds an old wooden desk in the attic. A single nameplate rests on it. C. Reeves, Julius. Beneath it, the surface is scorched as if a fire had burned through. But the wood is cold, untouched, and beneath the desk, in chalk, she skipped the test. Part 11. The attendance ledger. They find Crowley's original attendance book buried under the house. Every student's name is marked failed except for one at the bottom, added recently. Ethan Caldwell, in progress. Part 12. The reflection ritual. Julia performs a protective ritual from old teaching folklore. For mirrors placed at the cardinal points of the house. They shimmer at midnight and show her the classroom as it once was. 30 children, a blackboard full of shifting equations, and Ethan seated in the back row. Part 13. The chalk dust wakes. Ethan begins coughing up dust, chalk dust. It stains his sheets. One morning, his breath fogs out as if he's in a freezer. When he exhales near the window, new words appear in the condensation. Show your answers. Part 14. The salt circle breaks. A protective salt line placed around his bed is broken during the night. Julia resets it, but the chalk outline of a desk appears beside him on the floor. That night, he dreams of taking an exam in a language he's never seen, but somehow understands. Part 15, The First Pupil. They find a gravestone in a forgotten field. A small one, marked L. No date. No epitaph. Local records show no child buried there. But that night, Ethan sees a child's reflection in his mirror, mouthing, "You were the first to fail." Part 16, The Echo Class. Julia and Ethan discover every room in the house carries the same subtle resonance. When speaking, their voices overlap by half a second. They test the sound with music. The echo continues after they stop playing. Then a voice says, "Next question." Part 17, Bell Without a Ringer. An antique school bell is found buried beneath the cellar stairs. It rings only when no one is in the room. When Ethan records it, the playback has a whisper layered inside. He still grades. Part 18, Ink That Crawls. An old ledger from the attic begins to fill itself in. Names, dates, emotions, sins. Julia watches as her secrets appear in ink. One entry reads, "Failed compassion, punishment, isolation." Part 19, Locked Inside the Lesson. Ethan attempts to leave the property. Every road loops him back. His phone GPS spins. A man in a janitor's uniform appears at the roadside, holding a bell. His face is blank slate. His badge says, "Substitute." Part 20, The Administrator's Seal. Julia finds reference to an obscure teaching demon known only as the Administrator, an entity that inhabits failed institutions. He doesn't punish learning, she explains. He punishes forgetting. Part 21, Group Photo. The mirror in the living room displays a sepia-toned photo not physically present. In it, Ethan, Julia, and shadowed children stand before the house, smiling. In the top corner, Crowley stands, blurred and grinning. His caption, Faculty Advisor. Part 22, The Principal's Office. They break into the sealed subcellar. A door reads Principal's Office. Inside, a chair facing the wall. A tape recorder plays a looping voice. Final warning. Disobedience will be punished. Part 23, Makeup Exam. Crowley's voice echoes from the old speaker system. Those who skip class may retake the test. Julia screams as her body lifts from the ground, eyes forced open by unseen hands. Ethan recites answers he never learned, and the house releases her. Part 24, Absentee List. They find a scroll of names burned into the floorboards. Hundreds of them, all marked missing. All dates end on a Thursday. Tomorrow is Thursday. Part 25, Erased. Ethan disappears. The mirrors no longer show him. Julia hears him calling from the pages of Crowley's journal. His voice is ink now, his soul rewritten. Part 26, Substitute's Arrival. A new figure appears. Cleaner coat, polished shoes, no face. The students' shadows rise again. The new teacher carries a ruler made of bone. He says, "Today's topic, obedience." Part 27, Faculty Meeting. Julia is summoned in a dream to a long table. Other teachers sit with hollow eyes. Crowley sits at the head. "You passed," he says. "Now you teach." Part 28, The Syllabus. Crowley's true plan emerges, to build a spiritual school, timeless, without walls. Each failure feeds it. Each fear sustains it. Julia must now choose whether to continue the cycle or end it by failing completely. Part 29, The Final Reflection. Julia uses the mirror ritual one last time. She sees Crowley's true form, a fractured man, endlessly reviewing papers he cannot read. She offers him mercy. He says, "There's no grade for forgiveness." Part 30, Dismissal Bell. The house begins to collapse. Students dissolve into dust. Crowley vanishes. The window glass clears. Outside, the sun rises. Ethan is found at the edge of town, holding a school bell in his hand, eyes open, and finally smiling. Part 31, The Substitute Bell. Long form, roughly 1.5 printed pages at 12 points font. Claire Evans couldn't shake the message on her courtyard window. She scrubbed the glass with bleach, then vinegar, even dry erase cleaner, but each dawn the words "I'm watching your class" bled back through the condensation as though the pain itself exhaled them. By day, she dismissed it as pranks from high schoolers living in the complex. Yet every night, the tapping returned. Always 4 slow knocks, like a teacher's knuckle on a desk commanding silence. That fourth evening, the taps came earlier, just after sunset. Claire jerked upright from grading quizzes. The room's overhead lights sputtered, dimmed, and turned a sickly projector bulb yellow. Outside, the courtyard security lamps flickered in sync. She forced herself toward the window, mug of pens trembling in her fist like an improvised weapon. The courtyard below lay empty except for swirling black grains she first mistook for gnats, until they drifted upward in coiling vectors, sliding across the glass as iron filings would chase a magnet. They spelled a new line beneath the original warning. First period starts at dawn. Claire's knees buckled, the pens scattered, their colorful ink pooling on laminate like spilled blood. Hundreds of miles away, Grace Mitchell sat at the Moonvale Diner's lone corner booth, fingers laced around a bitter cup of late-shift coffee. Across from her, Professor Henry Coleman unfolded a map of the eastern seaboard. Thin arrows of soot traced a path from the ashes of the Moonvale schoolhouse to scattered rural towns, always toward larger population centers. Black sand samples he'd bottled weeks earlier now vibrated inside their vials, magnetized not to the earth, but to something farther northeast. "We're watching a migration," he said hoarsely. Crowley's essence broke when the shard shattered, but fragments still haunt eyes, classrooms full of them. He tapped a red circle over Dayton, Ohio. Your bell sounded in Moonvale the same night, their citywide museum alarms tripped. Something's collecting relics, Grace. Grace's mind flashed to Alex Walker, still recovering in a psychiatric ward. He'd begun drawing endless rows of empty desks, always leaving one chair at the back dripping in charcoal, like a vacancy waiting for its next occupant. She swore she heard that same emptiness echoing when her own window latch rattled nightly. "I'll follow the drift," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "If the lesson moved, I need to warn the next town before first period begins." Claire Evans spent the night making barricades. Couch against the hall door, bookshelves wedged beneath the knob. She taped heavy blankets over the window pane, then sat at her kitchen table watching the digital clock blink 3:03 a.m. Between ticks, silence thickened until even her breaths seemed intrusions. From behind the blanket came the screech of chalk on slate, long, roaming arcs. Claire slashed the fabric with a carving knife and yanked it down. The glass glowed from an unseen light source. Across its surface stretched fresh writing, but this time the words were backwards, as though scrawled from inside the apartment. No absences accepted. In the reflection of that ghost ink, Claire saw her own face. Yet her eyes appeared blacked out, voids reaching infinitely behind her skull. She screamed, clapped trembling hands to her sockets. When she looked again, the reflection returned to normal, but another line had appeared beneath the first. "Bring your best behavior." Something thunked in the bedroom. Her antique schoolteacher's handbell, a decorative heirloom inherited from her grandmother, toppled from its shelf. It rang once, impossibly loud, the bronze mouth vibrating on hardwood. Claire hurled a quilt over it, but the clang echoed in her teeth, reverberating through the pipes, the light fixtures, the very marrow of the building. Across town, security guards at the Mallory County Historical Museum watched surveillance monitors erupt in snow. In the static coalesced the silhouette of a tall, slim man wearing a 1940s schoolmaster's coat. With deliberate calm, he approached a glass display case housing artifact from the defunct Pleasant Hill Elementary. Among them, an obsidian shard labeled Unknown Ritual Mirror. The feed blanked. When cameras restored 20 seconds later, the shard and the silhouette were gone. All that remained on the dusty floor were 13 perfect chalk circles, each framing a tiny black grain glittering like shattered stars. At 4:45 a.m., Claire's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, but dread loves false hope. On the screen flashed Grace M., though Claire didn't know any Grace. She answered. "Listen carefully," said a breathless voice over roaring wind. Cover every reflective surface, mirrors, screens, especially windows. Do not acknowledge the tapping, and whatever you do, don't let the bell ring again. I'm 6 hours out. Hold on until I. Static swallowed the call, but not before one unmistakable sound pierced through. A cracked, ancient bell tolling exactly 4 times. Claire's classroom orientation packet lay open on her desk, schedule highlighted in yellow. First period, 8 a.m. She watched the digital clock switch to 5 a.m. Felt the building tremor as if hundreds of tiny feet shuffled into invisible desks. Somewhere in the Ohio dawn, an unseen teacher cleared his throat and began to call the roll. Part 32, Bullets in the Chalk Dust. Length, roughly a page and a half at standard print size. Grace Mitchell's rental sedan roared west along I-70, wipers slapping warm June rain into blurry sheet music on the windshield. Every few miles, the radio spat static that organized itself into half-phrases, roll call murmurs, children reciting multiplication tables out of sync. At 6:16 a.m., her GPS froze. The screen grayed, then displayed a single line in Courier New. "Stay in your lane, Ms. Mitchell." Grace punched the power button, but the unit wouldn't die. The sedan's headlights flickered even though dawn already smeared apricot across Ohio cornfields. She pressed harder on the gas. The engine howled. Behind her, the rearview mirror mottled black, erasing the road's reflection and replacing it with a faint classroom silhouette. Rows of heads, every skull turning as one to face the mirror. Grace tore the mirror from its mount, hurled it onto the passenger floorboard, and kept driving. Across town, Claire Evans huddled in her bathtub, the only spot she'd managed to line with duct-taped garbage bags, heavy quilts, and cardboard. The window in the main room had started breathing. The glass exhaled warm fog, inhaled her cold terror. Every cycle etched deeper letters that bled crimson condensation onto the sill. Now they read, "Pop quiz in 30 minutes. Show your work." Claire checked her phone, 7:27 a.m. With shaking thumbs, she dialed 911 again. The call routed, connected, then dissolved into the same scraping chalk timbre. What is 5 times 13? She threw the phone, shattering it against tile. A metallic clang echoed from the living room. The antique handbell, still swaddled in the fallen quilt, was sliding across hardwood by itself, inch by inch, toward the locked bedroom door. Claire bolted out of the tub, adrenaline overriding fear, and yanked her grandmother's old service revolver from shoebox. She'd never fired it. Her father had insisted it was empty. Tonight she had loaded it with the only bullets the pawn shop sold her, rock-salt shells meant for farm vermin. Not lethal to a man, maybe lethal to a ghost. The bell reached the door and rang once. Every light bulb in the apartment flashed to blinding magnesium white, then burst. Darkness swallowed the flat, except for the window, which glowed like a projector screen. On it flickered a grainy black and white film. Claire's own classroom at Emerson High, empty except for a tall figure writing equations on the smartboard with a length of chalk that never shortened. The figure turned. Hollow sockets stared through the glass and impossibly into the apartment. His mouth stretched wider than human jaws allowed. The sound that poured through the window was no longer chalk but the bellow of a rusted bell, stretched into a scream. Claire fired. The slug of crystallized salt punched through the glass, not shattering it but rippling it like pond water. The window bulged outward, then snapped back, flinging the slug onto the floor where it hissed in a black vapor. New letters surfaced on the pane, formed by negative space where the vapor refused to cling. Incorrect. Show your eyes. The bedroom door hinges shrieked. With a thunder crack, the antique bell blasted into the air, struck the ceiling, and rang twice more, totaling the teacher's dreaded count of 4. Every covered mirror in the apartment burst its shrouds. Reflections bled onto walls, projecting jittery reels of children screaming in silent hallways. Claire braced to fire again, but the gun's barrel sagged, molten, as if it had been held over a forge. Salt pellets drummed to the floor, spinning like chalk nubs. From each pellet sprouted a thin column of white dust that twisted into miniature desks. Within seconds, a classroom of salt effigies filled the living room. 30 child shapes seated, blank-faced, all turned toward her. A final desk rose, larger, imposing, then cracked down the middle as the eyeless teacher stepped through the tear in the window pane, crossing dimensions as if through a doorway of liquid glass. He lifted the bell. It fell silent in midair, yet Claire felt the toll inside her ribcage. Attendance, the teacher rasped, voice a chorus of throatless children. Eyes front. Claire's vision tunneled. Invisible fingers pried her eyelids wide. Across the city, every student at Emerson High looked up from homeroom as classroom windows darkened and black grains of sand clattered softly onto their desks like the first drops of a storm. At 7:59 a.m., Grace skidded into Claire's parking lot. The sky above the complex had turned slate gray despite sunrise, and faint bell peals rolled like distant thunder. She slammed the car door, clutching Coleman's relic camera in one hand and a mason jar of consecrated salt in the other. Somewhere on the third floor, a cracked bell chimed for the fourth and final time. Grace sprinted for the stairwell, knowing the bell marked not the beginning of class, but the start of the final exam. Part 33, the hall without doors. Grace bounded up the stairwell, heart ricocheting against her ribs. Her shoes slapped wet concrete, echoing like someone was following just a step behind. But when she turned, no one was there. A low-frequency hum filled the building, like an old television left on in another room, and the walls shimmered with heatless static. She reached the third floor. The hallway was wrong. All the apartment doors had vanished. Where units once stood, there now stretched a seamless stretch of decaying plaster, its color leaching from yellow to funeral gray. The walls pulsed like lungs. Grace turned to retreat, only to find the stairwell behind her bricked over. She was inside the echo now. The teacher's echo. From a speaker that didn't exist, a PA crackled to life. Today's lesson, Revelation. The lights above buzzed and blinked in Morse-like flickers. Grace closed her eyes, whispering one of the night council's incantations Coleman had scrawled on a crumpled napkin. Let no eye take root where it has no soul. When she opened them, the hallway was filled with desks. Old ones, wooden, ink wells on the right corner, rusty metal feet grating the warped tile floor. Sitting in them were students made of shadows, their skin painted in shades of slate and storm cloud, each one unmoving except for slow, synchronized breathing. At the end of the hall stood a single blackboard. It wasn't bolted to the wall. It was the wall, pulsing like obsidian flesh. Etched into it was Claire's name, underlined twice. Beneath it, final exam, eyes forward. The shadow students turned their heads toward Grace. Then slowly they smiled. Part 34, the obsidian lens. Claire had fallen to her knees. Her vision doubled, then tripled. Dozens of chalkboards spun around her mind like carnival wheels. On every one, her name was written, paired with phrases like incomplete, plagiarized, and eyes absent. The eyeless teacher loomed at the front of the living room-turned classroom, one skeletal finger tapping the side of her face, as if knocking on her skull to get the answers out. On the floor, the salt children sat perfectly still. Every pair of invisible eyes drilled into her. And though she couldn't see them, Claire felt each gaze prying her memories open, one by one. Her first day as a student teacher, her mother's funeral, the college paper she never turned in, the test she cheated on in 10th grade, the exam she gave last week. Every lie, every truth, all of it made visible. The teacher's hand opened, revealing a fragment of obsidian, round, polished, the size of a contact lens. He pressed it to Claire's forehead, and it fused to her skin, sending a bolt of memory so vivid through her spine that she screamed. She was no longer in the room. She was at a desk, in the 1982 schoolhouse. She looked down and saw small hands. Children's hands. She was one of them. She turned and saw the others. The fear in their eyes. The teacher closing the classroom door for the last time. The sound of locks, bolts, chains. And then darkness. the sound of locks, bolts, chains, and then darkness, sobbing, scratching, screaming, a chisel, and after the screams ended, silence. Only the teacher, standing in front of the class, digging into his own face. Claire gasped and snapped back to her body, the black shard hissing on her forehead like a branding iron. The teacher leaned down. "Now you've seen what I saw," he said. "But what will you do with it?" Part 35. Grace's intervention. Grace emerged into the apartment at last, though it no longer looked like an apartment. The furniture had melted into desk rows, the walls replaced with slate and chalkboards that reached the ceiling. Claire was slumped at the center, twitching. Her eyes were fluttering wildly, a smudge of black glistening on her forehead. The teacher turned his head toward Grace. He was larger than she remembered, taller than the ceiling should allow, his coat made of stitched lesson plans and failed report cards. His hands were long enough to reach across the room. He pointed at her. "You don't belong here." Grace lifted Coleman's relic, the 1982 plate camera, refurbished, reinforced with sigils inked in her own blood. She spoke clearly, every word drawn from Knight Council doctrine. "Let the lesson see itself." The camera clicked. Flash powder exploded in a white fireball. The teacher screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was denial. The classroom cracked. Every desk, every chalkboard shuddered. The children's silhouettes burst into grains of salt. Time folded, unfolded, stuttered. Grace saw flickers of every classroom the teacher had visited across 4 decades. Hundreds of them. And finally, she saw the original reflection. The moment Isaiah Crowley had looked into the black shard before carving out his eyes. The plate captured it all, trapped it, and the teacher froze. His hands dropped. His head bowed. Chalk crumbled from his coat like shedding skin. Claire gasped, the obsidian mark peeling from her forehead in a puff of smoke. The teacher collapsed forward, turning into a puddle of wet ash. Just before he vanished completely, he whispered, "Thank you." The apartment blinked. It was just an apartment again. The window pane was shattered, the antique bell in pieces, and the chalk letters were gone. Claire opened her eyes. "Is it over?" she asked, barely audible. Grace glanced at the old camera, steam still rising from its brass casing. She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "It's documented now." And behind them, the photo plate inside the camera shimmered faintly. Something still moved. Part 36. The developing room. 3 days later, Grace arrived at a secure facility in Maryland, a weather-beaten archive compound where Henry Coleman had worked decades ago. Beneath the main building lay a darkroom still in use by the last living members of the Knight Council. 3 elderly individuals who remembered Isaiah Crowley's trial, though the world never called it that. The photograph plate had remained sealed in the camera since the encounter in Claire's apartment, but its casing had grown warm. Once, it even pulsed like a living heart. Inside the pitch-black room, under faint red light, they opened it. What emerged wasn't a photo. It was a moving image, projected on the wall, without any bulb or projector, was a looping 5-second reel. Crowley lunging a young boy in 1982, chisel raised, his own face twisted with a look of terror, not rage. Every time the reel ended, Crowley looked straight at the lens, as though pleading. Then the loop restarted. Coleman, watching remotely via secure feed, said hoarsely, "It's sentient." "More than that," Grace replied. "It wants to be seen." One of the Knight Council elders, a nearly blind man named Felix, began to chant softly, a sight-binding spell. But the plate vibrated violently, flinging itself from the wall into a metal cabinet. The loop stopped, but only for now. "Contain it," Grace ordered. But in the corner of the room, a tall filing cabinet door slowly creaked open. Inside lay hundreds of old police files and school records. On each folder, the ink bled sideways into one word. Review. Part 37. Claire's return. Claire Evans took a leave of absence from Emerson High. Her neighbors assumed she was recovering from trauma. Maybe a break-in, maybe worse, but no one knew the truth. Not even Claire. She remembered everything, and yet there were gaps. Flashes. The children's eyes turning toward her. The sensation of someone else blinking with her eyelids. The whisper, finals are coming. She stayed in a motel near the outskirts of Dayton. The curtains remained drawn. She never faced the mirror for more than 3 seconds. Still, now and then, she'd catch motion behind her in the reflection. Someone tall, wearing a coat of paper, holding a cracked bell. Grace visited one evening. They spoke little. Grace simply handed her a leather-bound book, Coleman's Final Journal. Inside were transcripts of similar cases from other states, some dating back to the 1950s. Bell men who stalked school children. Teachers who went missing only to reappear decades later, blind and mumbling about testing days. At the very back of the journal, a single page was left blank until Claire touched it. Words appeared in her own handwriting. Attendance never ends. Part 38, broadcast. In a data center outside Richmond, Virginia, strange anomalies began affecting education servers. Automated roll call systems logged names that didn't exist. Surveillance footage from classrooms showed rows of children, but with all faces blurred beyond recognition. Even though live observers swore the students looked normal. A tech flagged the error and isolated a suspicious software patch marked Legacy Behavior to DLL, supposedly part of a teacher scheduling program. But when they tried to delete it, the monitor blacked out and briefly displayed a chalkboard. Just one phrase scrawled in cursive. Are your eyes open? Then the system crashed. The patch reinstalled itself, now embedded in thousands of school computers across 3 states. Grace got the call at midnight. They're not using Windows anymore, Coleman warned. They're using screens. Part 39, the eye that watches. That night, Claire woke to a ringing bell. Not in the room, but inside her ears. She staggered to the mirror. On her forehead, just above the bridge of her nose, a tiny black had formed. No blood, no bruising, just obsidian the size of a grain of sand. And beneath her eyes, faint lines resembling tiny desks had appeared in the whites. Her pupils twitched. For a moment, she saw another classroom. Not hers. Not in this time. Ancient, candlelit stone walls. At the far end, a tall man in tattered robes stood behind a pulpit. He raised his hand, not in blessing but command. Children in chains bowed their heads. One boy lifted his, stared into Claire's vision, and whispered, "Your turn." She fell backward, slamming into the nightstand. When she awoke, the black dot was gone. But a paper had printed from her motel fax machine, despite no connection. A simple attendance sheet. Claire's name was circled. Next to it, in red ink, present. Eyes verified. Part 40, the 5th bell. In Moonvale, the ashes of the schoolhouse grew cold. But below ground, in the forgotten tunnel that once led to the subcellar, something shifted. Salt began to melt. Grains that had long resisted time began fusing, reforming. Not into desks or chairs, but into a frame. A door frame. On it hung a single bronze bell. Cracked. Ancient. It had rung 4 times. And then once more. The 5th bell. No one heard it with ears. But across the country, Grace, Claire, the elders, Coleman, the students who survived, and even Alex Walker, all of them paused mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath. They had heard it with something older than hearing. And they understood. The classroom is no longer confined. The test has begun. And the teacher? He has no need for eyes. Because now, he watches through ours. Part 41, the digital chalkboard. In an elementary school just outside Nashville, Tennessee, a teacher named Mr. Bennett booted up his smartboard at 8:01 a.m. to begin the day's lesson. But instead of his scheduled slideshow, the screen displayed a perfectly drawn chalkboard. No menu, no controls, no way to exit. Across the board were scrawled dozens of names. Some were his students, some he didn't recognize. Then, slowly, letters formed on the screen in real time, scratching as though actual chalk moved across glass. Today, recall everything you regret. You try to shut it down, pull the plug, even cover the screen with a bulletin board. But the sound continued. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound of someone writing inside his head. By 8:17 a.m., Mr. Bennett had locked himself in the janitor's closet and gouged out the smartboard's touch sensors with a pencil. He was found mumbling, "I can't fail again. I won't." Part 42, Claire's Awakening. Claire woke in her motel room with her pillow soaked in sweat and the bed sheets curled around her legs like restraints. This time, she hadn't dreamed. She had remembered. She'd seen herself in another life, a teacher in the 19th century, a schoolhouse lit by gas lamps, desks bolted to the floor, students carved into silence. And in front of her, Isaiah Crowley, younger, still human, a guest lecturer. But his eyes were already black. He had looked at her across time. "Some debts," he whispered, "require reincarnated payment." Claire ran to the bathroom mirror. The black speck on her forehead had split. Now it resembled a keyhole. Part 43, The Council Reforms. In a hidden compound in New Hampshire, Grace convened what remained of the Night Council. 8 chairs stood around the candlelit table, 5 filled by aged faces and 3 by new ones. Claire Evans, tech expert Roshan Patel, and a former Catholic exorcist turned academic named Sister Madeline. "The classroom is no longer physical," Grace said. "It's viral, cultural, psychological." Coleman, speaking through an old radio patch from a secure line, added, "We're not fighting a ghost anymore. We're fighting an idea that's learning, teaching itself, multiplying." Roshan confirmed that a pattern of glitches and power surges aligned with education platforms across the eastern seaboard, always preceded by smartboard failures, login corruption, and increased student absences. "We're dealing with mimetic education," he said. "It infects through observation." "And how do we kill an idea?" Claire asked. Sister Madeline crossed herself. "We answer the final question." Part 44, The Return to Moonvale. The group traveled back to Moonvale under cover of night. The crater where the school once stood was gone, replaced with perfectly level, untouched grass. No flowers, no trees, nothing, except one thing. A desk, singular, ancient wood. Carved into the surface was a single line. "Who taught the first teacher?" Claire stood over it, her breath visible in summer air. "This is the question," she whispered. "The one at the end of the test." Beneath the desk, the ground trembled. A long crack opened. A narrow staircase descended into earth. They entered without speaking. The bell chimed once. Part 45, The Archive Below. They descended into a vault. Rows of old desks, blackboards suspended in darkness, but glowing faintly. Each board pulsed with a name and a date. Some modern, some ancient. One read Plato, 427 BC. Another, Sophia C. Walker, 2032 AD. Claire recognized her own mother's name. Dead 5 years, but listed for next year's attendance. "This is where the names go when they're accepted," Madeline murmured. "Accepted into what?" Roshan asked. Grace stepped forward. "Into the eternal lesson, the unfinished curriculum." A final board hovered at the far end. On it, Isaiah Crowley with the status unresolved. Part 46, The Inverted Lesson Plan. The board for Crowley flickered. Symbols, mathematical, scriptural, pagan, began to rearrange on the surface. They realized Crowley had never been the source. He was a conduit. The first teacher had spoken through him, used him. Claire touched the board and screamed. She saw a vast black hall with millions of desks, all filled. The students had no mouths, no hands, only eyes, all pointed at a central stage where a massive, shadow-wrapped figure scratched its fingernail across a galaxy-sized chalkboard. Each stroke warped time. The original teacher, the one who taught Isaiah Crowley. And it had no name, only a title, The Administrator. Part 47, Exit Ticket. They fled the vault. As they climbed the staircase, words formed on the wall in glowing red chalk. Answer or stay. The door above sealed. One chance. One question. Claire whispered. The first teacher wasn't taught. It is teaching. It was born teaching. It teaches itself. The wall paused. The letters glowed, then faded. The door unlocked. They emerged back into the crater. The bell rang a second time. Part 48, The Eye Tower. Back in D.C., Roshan decrypted corrupted data from the Crowley camera plate. Inside the code, a signal, a precise frequency. He traced it to an abandoned radio tower in West Virginia, a forgotten Cold War relic. But when the team arrived, the tower was alive. Wires slithered like vines. Static poured from every direction. Screens installed inside pulsed with open eyes. Thousands of them. Claire's face appeared on every screen. Then Grace's. Then Coleman's. Then Isaiah Crowley's. Then the administrators. Broadcasting, Roshan gasped. It's preparing to teach the world. Part 49, the final class. The team made a final plan. Coleman's plate, combined with the obsidian lens, could disrupt the signal. But it needed to be done from inside the tower. Claire volunteered. She climbed the central staircase, carrying the plate and the shard. On every screen, children watched her. Shadow children. Dead children. The administrator loomed on the central feed. Its voice, layered and deep, spoke in every language at once. Why do you fear the lesson? Claire answered, because it never ends. And with that, she smashed the obsidian into the plate. A blinding white flash tore through the tower. All screens went black. Part 50, after the bell. In the silence that followed, people around the country paused mid-word, mid-walk, mid-thought. Then they continued, unaware of what had passed. The bell had rung 4 times, but never a 5th. The administrator had been silenced for now. Claire never returned from the tower. But months later, a letter arrived at Grace's doorstep. It had no stamp, no return address. Inside, a school attendance slip. Claire Evans, present. Eyes verified. Test completed. Final score. Reflection passed. And at the bottom, a faint chalked sentence. Some students graduate. Others become teachers.